The new Pfizer RSV vaccine for pregnant women has shown a high rate of preterm births. This should not be a surprise because that was in their clinical trials, but we are seeing in real world observation more than they reported in their clinical trials. But even though they did see in their clinical trials that this RSV vaccine for pregnant women did have a high rate of preterm births, why did the FDA approve it anyway? Well, who knows? I'm beginning to suspect that the FDA doesn't have human health in mind. Maybe they have Pfizer's financial health in mind. I don't know. So here's the recent study. They are studying the VAERS system, that's Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. This is a reporting system that if someone has a bad reaction to a vaccine, they then report it and it's tracked. But not really. So we're going to talk about that in a second. Now, this is what this study did was take VAERS data for women who took the vaccine in their third trimester from last September until February of this year. And it shows a very high rate of adverse reactions overall, and a high rate of vaccines that induce preterm birth. And also, I'm going to show you these closer, but I just want to show you them together. Here are all the adverse events that were listed. I know you can't see this really well, and I also did link you to the study in the newsletter this morning, so I hope you're subscribed to the newsletter so you can get all this data yourself. But it does show that there were at least 77 VAERS reports. 27 of them were preterm births, but you see here we have at least one fetal death, which is interesting. We're going to talk about this fetal death. This means that the baby died after this mother was vaccinated. We're going to talk about that because GlaxoSmithKline stopped their vaccine trials when they got neonatal deaths. So now we've got one in Pfizer, but it's still going forward. No one's worried about this, by the way. The paper was published. It shows that these bad things are happening to a high rate of pregnant women when they get this vaccine. And that's it. Like, it's not a government that's raising the alarm bell. It's just a study. Now, I think we should take this all with a grain of salt because VAERS data is typically very low and unrepresented. So you have to think that most people who have bad reactions to vaccines do not report that. And the numbers are usually artificially low by design. Now, this is from the book that I've recommended several times, Turtles All the Way Down, that talks about exactly why. And it's a scan because I have a real book. I'm sorry, I couldn't get you a screenshot. I don't know if you can see my sloppy handwriting in purple in the last paragraph, but this talks about why VAERS data is so unreliable and low. It's because they only take data from three sources: vaccine manufacturers, healthcare professionals, and the general public. But only the manufacturers are required by law to report vaccine adverse events. Doctors are not. Now, why would that be? Patients and healthcare workers, most of the time, they don't know where to send those reports. Most patients don't. For instance, parents don't know, like, oh, I should report that to somewhere. They're not given, like when your kid gets a shot, you're not given a pamphlet and saying, oh, if something happens, call this. They're not educated about that at all. Contrast that to the law that requires doctors to report infectious diseases to the CDC. Why does the government want to know by requirement about infectious diseases, but they don't want to know about vaccine adverse reactions? That's weird, right? So this study of the VAERS reporting system, again, we're going to call these 77 reports very low, but we're going to look at them because it's all we've got. And again, more than half of them were serious enough to require the mother to be hospitalized within a day of the vaccination. Take a look at this chart. And at least 12% of these reported preterm birth or other events that led to preterm birth, which is not good for the baby. The longer they stay in there, the better. And then it led to C-sections because the mother was not able to dilate. It was too early. And so they don't get the full benefit of a vaginal birth, which is better for the baby. And most mothers want to at least try to get there. So you have to ask, are they given informed consent when they get this vaccine about what this may do to their baby's long-term health and their pregnancy? Now, Pfizer publicized most of this data in their clinical trials in the summer of 2023. Take a look at this Yahoo News report in May of 2023 about how this vaccine was being tested on pregnant women, but the safety markers were not great, so they weren't ready.
Later in the third trimester is when it seemed to have the best efficacy, as well as strongest protection up to 30 days versus after that. Now, Pfizer is competing with GlaxoSmithKline for RSV vaccines. We did note specifically that GSK actually dropped out or paused their phase 3 because of certain safety signals, which you can see, of course, indicated in those votes there, specifically on preterm births. Pfizer noted 5.6% in their vaccine group versus 4.7% in placebo. GlaxoSmithKline noted 6.8% in their vaccine group versus 4.9% in placebo. So the placebo numbers are pretty close. They also do have some similar indications. One major difference is that GlaxoSmithKline's group also had neonatal deaths reported. So that was a significant safety signal as well. That's what started that pause. So,
okay, but she goes on to sort of root, like, hopefully we'll get there, right? Because we want a vaccine to tell you about. That's awesome. She seems very conflicted in even giving you these numbers at all, because the news media doesn't like to tell you about adverse events. But nothing changed. Those numbers remained in all the trials we were given, and the FDA said, okay, acceptable risk. Although now we're not seeing that it's a 5.9% or in the fives at all. It's of the adverse events, almost half of them are having preterm births. Now, what she said there was correct, that GlaxoSmithKline paused their trials because they had neonatal deaths and Pfizer didn't. But now they do with this new VAERS reporting. Take a look at this study showing at least one fetal death.
Again, we should remind people the VAERS reporting is a fraction of the actual cases, right? It is intense amount of paperwork. It is incredibly inaccurate because it only represents a snapshot, a tiny fraction of all of these cases.
Absolutely. So now that we do have at least one reported death, anyone want to do anything about that? Bueller?
Of course not.
Anybody? Yesterday, we reported that the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine, which the UK government knew was causing severe harm in March of 2021, was not pulled from the rollout until May of 2021, and people died in the interim getting this vaccine that they knew was problematic. So maybe we want to learn from that mistake and move a little bit faster if there are any deaths reported and these adverse events. These are, again, I'm not saying it's not worth it. I'm saying, why is nobody asking the questions? These are the questions. And another relevant question is that, is this vaccine preventing babies from contracting and dying from RSV? So is it worth it? That's sort of what we should ask collectively. Is one neonatal death worth the fact that maybe 10 babies will not die from RSV? Well, the death rate for RSV is low, even though RSV is more dangerous for small babies and elderly people. It still has a low death rate for healthy babies. And we're not given this data. What we are given is the first round of clinical trials that showed that RSV vaccination of pregnant mothers did reduce hospitalizations, but they did not even assess whether it reduced infant death from RSV. In fact, they said so. This is from the clinical trials showing no infant deaths were assessed by the investigator as related to maternal vaccinations. So they just don't tell us. So how many babies died in order to prevent other babies from being hospitalized? We can sort of surmise now that we have one neonatal death to maybe prevent around 21 hospitalizations. That's what the vaccine clinical trials showed. But we're not even really sure about that. And we can't make many choices about it because the last rounds of clinical trials are not yet published, which is something I see increasingly every time we look at these vaccines. We just don't get the clinical trials before the FDA approves them. And most of the time in the FDA's press statement, they're like, They use the words acceptable, that we observed acceptable safety standards or whatever. So pregnant mothers are not given the full picture. Do they take this vaccine and risk a preterm delivery and possible neonatal death to prevent what we only know may prevent hospitalization, but not a bad outcome, not death? And I know that RSV is very serious for small babies. In fact, I had a small baby that had RSV. Here's my daughter, Ava, when she was 6 months old. And she's going to be 12 next week.
Little baldy.
Yes, she was super bald. And so, would I have risked a preterm birth to save ourselves what was not a fun experience, taking my baby to stay in the hospital for 3 days on Christmas? I don't think I would have, because that outcome has a higher rate of survivability. Well, I'm not saying the vaccine doesn't have a high rate of survivability, but taking a chance like that, you're supposed to be given these numbers when you're offered this vaccine. I wager most pregnant women are not given this. And so I'm giving you the numbers. We're asking those questions. You let me know if you think that these are acceptable risks. And why is no one asking the FDA if there's a fetal death? Why don't we pull this? I'm just asking. I'm just curious. Those are the questions.
I really hope you enjoyed watching this video. YouTube thinks that you'll actually like this next video right here. It's personalized based on your own viewing habits. So if you watch the video, please leave a comment. Let us know what you think about it. And we will see you next time, everyone.